So basically, to me, gamification is the use of game elements in traditionally non-game settings. So, for example, that might be the use of providing some levels as somebody levels up, as they gain more information. It might be a form of a badge where somebody may earn a badge for learning some information. It's also, though, a little bit broader. Sometimes I view gamification as a continuum, because sometimes gamification is adding a little bit of playfulness or a little bit of game thinking or even a game to the whole journey of instruction. So if we look at learning not as an event, but as an unfolding occurrence of information to try to make people better, smarter, faster, those types of things, gamification really is the whole concept or idea of thinking about using game and game elements to ultimately get to the learning outcome that we want. So, but I think gamification is kind of an umbrella under which we can encompass a lot of highly engaging, highly interactive activities that keeps the learners focused on the area that we want them to be focused on. So that's really what gamification allows you to do, is to take content that the learner needs to learn and present it to them in a way that's interesting and motivating. So you take elements of games like points, like leaderboards, you take badging, you take levels, you take progress, and you provide that in an environment where it's very game-like, but it's not actual game itself. The difference between that is that's using pieces of games. So you might have points, but you might not have anything else. Well, you can't just play a game with points. You need story, or you need levels, or you need. So then gamification maybe adds points and badges, but doesn't have the whole game space that you play in, and the content remains pretty much like you would learn. You would see a video, or you would see some content or answer some multiple choice questions. That's gamification. A game is where you actually take content and manipulate that content to make that content into a challenge, and then to make it actually into a game space where you would pretty much stop everything else that you're doing and engage in that game, and usually for quite some period of time. So one of the things that's really started to come into forefront, although this is fascinating to me because it's been around since like the 1800s, is a thing called the Ebbing forgetting curve. And so that's really research that shows that the longer we're away from content, the more we forget about the content. It makes perfect sense. And so the technology was never available until now, until recently, to add intervention. So if we look, I'm going to go one more at another version of the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. We can see when we first learn something, we know 100% of it, and then over time we forget some. But if we get a little bit of a reminder of that information, we engage with that information a little bit, it takes us back up and to full learning of the content. And then again, over time we forget it. But if we keep doing that, we can actually bring up the amount of knowledge and the longer we've learned it. So what has happened with cell phones, mobile devices, and ubiquitous Wi-Fi is that we now have the ability. So it didn't make sense, 10 years ago to fly everybody in for 5 minutes of instruction, fly them all home, and fly them in the next week. But now that we have apps, phones, and Wi-Fi, we can take a very quick look at information, remind ourselves of what we need to know, and go on from there. And we can. The average person checks their smartphone about 9 times an hour, and they give content about less than 7 seconds to decide whether or not it should get their attention. So if you're not engaging them in 7 seconds, you're probably losing them. Now, I think, lots of different definitions, but two of the ones that I like are one from Donald Taylor over in the UK. And he says that micro-learning is learning from content that's accessed in short bursts. So I think it's really important. It's a short amount of information, maybe less than 5 minutes, and it's relevant to the individual at that point in time. So you want to know something very quickly, you go in, you look at it, and then you can do this over and over again so you can build retention and conceptual understanding. And the thing about this is, I get a little bit of information today, and maybe 2 days later I get a little information. There's a little bit of overlap in that information because that helps me retain and recall the information a little bit more effectively. John Eads, president of LearnLoft, says that really it's teaching and delivering content to learners in small, specific bursts. And typically, I think that micro-learning is one objective per learning event. And that's kind of, I think, how that works out. So there was a control group in India of men between 35 and 55, and they were glucose intolerant. So they were very susceptible to type 2 diabetes. And they assigned 2 different groups randomly. One group, they got the traditional intervention about what you should eat, what you should do. So it was stand-up, classroom-led instruction. The second group, though, got a series of behaviorally oriented reminders, basically, sent to their cell phone twice a day. So you'd get a behavioral reminder like bike to work instead of drive, or don't eat while you're watching TV because you'll overeat. And at the end of 2 years, they looked at the one group that got the traditional classroom instruction on what to do, what to not to do for diabetes, and the group that got these messages sent out over time. And they found out that the group that got the messages over time reduced the likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes by 36%. And that's a completely behavioral disease. Well, not completely, but highly controllable through behavior. So the answer is yes, we can actually nudge people toward a certain outcome that we want, much more directed, much more focused than we could in kind of a classroom where we're trying to cover everything in 8 hours. What I see, Jordan, often is this thing I call it shrunken head learning. So somebody takes an e-learning module that was in one of the authoring tools, and the authoring tools now have players, so you can play it on their phone. And so you just shrink down this e-learning course to fit on a phone, and you call that micro-learning. To me, that's not micro-learning. You don't take a course and shrink it, and voila, have micro-learning. It's a really painful process to go through. It should be designed for micro-learning and gamification from the beginning, not bolted on later on. The learner is really good at psyching out, yeah, this is kind of bolted on, and this is an afterthought. Same thing with chopping up. So somebody says, well, that's great, Karl. I'll just take an hour and a half e-learning course, and every 5 minutes we'll just chop it, and then we'll serve it chopped. Well, that doesn't work either, because you lose the context. You lose some of the integration that was already there, integrated. So now you need to design it and say, look, they might not get the next piece of this. So I got to make sure this piece stands on its own. And this piece, they need to know like what context it comes in, because I can't guarantee they're going to have the context beforehand. So it really is not as simple as chopping up longer courses and making them into simple concepts. And then don't make the topic too broad. You're using micro-learning, you're teaching very narrow, focused content. You're not boiling the ocean in 1 2-minute micro-learning segment, right? You're not teaching every aspect of the history of the earth. You really have to narrow down and say, okay, this is exactly what we're going to teach. And then finally, I think, and this is really important, and missed a lot, you need an overall strategy of how you're going to implement the micro-learning sequence. What we've done initially is created basically a 20-minute video, interactive video, about a caseworker who's confronted with possible child abuse. And this is mandated reporting. So the child care provider has to report incidences of child abuse. So you can imagine in some cases it's underreported when there should be a suspected case. In other cases, it's overreported. It's not really child abuse. Somebody just kind of overreacts. And the system has all kinds of noise in it. But it's required, so you have to do it. And then you only have the training once a year. So by the end of the year, you may forget what signs to look for or whatever. So we actually have taken this 20-minute video and mapped out a strategy of micro-learning throughout, in this case, 3 years, And a woman named Sarah Dorr did this, brilliantly put this together. But let me kind of walk you through this, because if you're thinking about microlearning, here's a really good way to think about it and map it back to your learning objectives. So in the first part of this table, we have learning objective and learning modules. So we have learning objective 1, understand and recognize possible child abuse. Learning objective 1.4, know signs and symptoms. And what learning modules are they in? Learning module 8 and learning module 24. And then we actually take a look at what micro-learning chunk are we focused on for this learning module. So here, bruises that are huge, bruises on somebody that doesn't walk yet is a huge red flag for any child. And we can see what content is in the learning model, and then we can see what's actually in the script, what we actually say in the script. Then we see the quiz questions. So we've tied the questioning, the assessment, all the way back to the learning objective. And then when we do the pinging or the micro-learning, we can see, look, we're going to send out a basic ping as what can cause a child to sustain a bruise, and the learner has to answer that question. This is months after they had the original training, so we're reinforcing that. Then we're asking them moderate questions. So now a learner drags and drops shapes onto a toddler to show where would you be concerned if you saw a bruise. And finally, we go to a website explaining Mongolian spots, which are often incorrectly identified as bruising. And then we finally say, how are we going to send that out? As a vignette, as a web resource, as a matching game. So if you're thinking about implementing microlearning and you really want to have learning outcomes, this is a really good template to think about your strategy for unveiling microlearning. So I would design a combination of both microlearning elements, gamification elements, as well as traditional instruction, hybrid webinars, and e-learning. And think of learning as more of an ecosystem than an event, and use these tools to create that rich ecosystem of learning, or blended learning, as Jody pointed out.